Super Mario 64, what a heck of a game. It brought Mario to 3D in a way that showed the world how 3D games were meant to be done, and all that. But along with it came a classic instant hit of a soundtrack. You remember it, right? Dire Dire Docks, Bob-omb Battlefield, who could forget songs like those? Except, have you? Do you remember them as they were in Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64? There's a chance you might not. If you look up the Bob-omb Battlefield theme on YouTube right now, you won't immediately find what was in the original game. It's close enough that it sounds right. It's still Bob-omb Battlefield, but what you're hearing is a ploy by Nintendo and maybe even YouTubers to cover up what the original soundtrack actually sounded like in the game in an attempt to gaslight you. Well, it's probably not that deep, but there's a surprising amount of versions of the Super Mario 64 soundtrack, all with their own differences. Let's take a step back and get to the bottom of this. First, here's a short clip of Bob-omb Battlefield from the US Nintendo 64 release of Super Mario 64. Now, here's the version you'll hear on YouTube. That's actually quite a difference, isn't it? What's going on here? Where's this version on YouTube from? The answer's actually kind of simple. It's from the official soundtrack, as in the physical CD release of the Super Mario 64 soundtrack. That's right, back when Nintendo were in their prime with making physical soundtracks of their games, they released one for Super Mario 64. It was made and published with the help of Pony Canyon, a company that helped make and release various soundtracks for media at the time. This made it kind of special because it had an entire team dedicated to re-engineering and touching up the game's music, rather than something like just making a simple line-in console recording. This soundtrack actually did so well it got a US printing and even one in Germany. Getting even a US release for a Nintendo soundtrack is incredibly rare, so this was kind of a big deal. And while Nintendo's official soundtrack releases are generally hit or miss, this one fixed up some issues that were present in the original game, and is generally considered a major improvement overall. Even if you don't think so, Nintendo sure did, because they took many of the changes and implemented them in newer releases of the game. They even used this official soundtrack version in the Super Mario 3D All-Stars soundtrack player. Let's take a look at some specific differences between the US Nintendo 64 version and this official soundtrack. One common difference between the two is the addition of reverb in the OST. While the Nintendo 64 version technically did have reverb, it was a primitive implementation that sounds more like a delay in practice. I think the OST did a pretty good job implementing it, and it sounds great in the mix. Another difference you can hear is just a pure quality difference. Like in Dire Dire Docks, the original has a lot of noise on every note, while the OST version is super clean. This is noticeable in other songs as well, but none are quite as obvious as in this one. Looking at a frequency spectrum of the OST version, you can see the main keys have a lot more unique information in the higher frequencies, unlike the Nintendo 64 version, which loses unique content past 16,000 kHz. There's also a lot of differences in the mix as a whole, things like instrument volume, panning, and just the shape of the sounds. For example, in the title theme, the main melodic instruments are centered in the OST, while the Nintendo 64 version had the steel drum panned a little bit to the right, and the organ chords a little further. This seems kind of strange considering they decided to keep or even intensify more extreme panning decisions in the OST. These types of differences are present to varying degrees across every single song between the two. But they didn't just add final touches like more reverb and better mixing. They made some pretty big changes to some of the instrument settings themselves. The best example can be seen in Bob-omb Battlefield. In fact, you may have even noticed it in the previous audio comparison. In the main lead, the voice sounding one playing the main melody, they tweaked the ADSR settings to have a longer release on the OST version. In the Nintendo 64, the release is very short, which means the sound stops pretty suddenly at the end of each note. While that can be a desired sound, I think most people would prefer the OST's choice to extend it here. Tweaks to the ADSR curves can be seen throughout the entire OST release, especially in the drums. Either way, all of these changes introduced in the OST version are pretty good, right? Well, I don't think they all are. In fact, there's some instances where I think the official soundtrack kind of ruined a song. In Looping Steps, the song that plays at the Endless Staircase, they made some pretty drastic adjustments that completely changes the way the song sounds. First, they changed the attack speed of the main leads, so they no longer have that soft, fading in attack. Instead, they just sound like normal keys. Then they absolutely killed the mix by lowering everything but the E-piano sound by way too much. Take a listen. Another one is the opening theme. In the Nintendo 64 version, the strings are very staccato and have a particular type of expression that just works. In the OST release, they have a lot more sustain to the point where they're not even really staccato anymore. To end the comparison of these two versions on a good note, Hazy Maze Cave has some pretty good changes in the official soundtrack version. In the intro, it starts without the pad chords, which I think helps build up the track as it goes, but the most noticeable differences are with the leads. In the intro part, the pitch-bending lead in the OST release bends a semitone lower than the Nintendo 64 version, which is a pretty big change in the feeling it has. When it gets to the main part of the song, where it plays a unique spin on the Super Mario Bros. Underground theme, you'll notice the main lead is held a lot longer, and it even has added vibrato on the parts that are flat out missing in the Nintendo 64 version. Overall, I think this is both one of the most changed and the most improved tracks in the OST version. Okay, so Nintendo released an OST where they went back and tried to touch everything up. Big deal. End of story, right? Not quite. Over the years, they had more plans for Super Mario 64, and in those plans included some of these changes they implemented in its official soundtrack, along with many others. If you're much into Nintendo, you probably already know what the Nintendo 64 DD is, but if you don't, it was pretty much an add-on you attached underneath your Nintendo 64 that allowed it to play games off of what were like really thick floppy disks. It was released in Japan in late 1999, and it never saw a release in the rest of the world due to low sales. There generally wasn't much released for it, but Nintendo were planning a lot with it at the time. In 2016, a prototype of a Super Mario 64 port for the Nintendo 64 DD leaked online. It's pretty much the same game with some minor differences here and there, and because of that, it's only speculated to have been a tech demo. But there's some changes with the music, some of which we see from the OST release. In Bob-on Battlefield, we see the main lead with the extended release that was introduced in the OST version. We also see some strange differences, like in the song Inside the Castle Walls. The strings sound very odd and have a full sustain in each note. The last notable changes can be seen in Hazy Maze Cave. While they didn't bring in the extended lead from the OST, there's a few other changes. The main plucky sign instrument has a different sound. There's less of a click and more frequencies in the high end. The rest of the changes in this version aren't major, and again seem like differences due to it coming from an unfinished prototype. Things like instrument volume differences, tuning differences, and even cases of missing or broken sounds. Don't get me wrong, all of this is pretty cool, but at the end of the day, it's still just an unfinished prototype that was never even released. Let's get into Super Mario 64's next real step. In 2004, Nintendo released Super Mario 64 DS for the Nintendo DS. It was a launch title with the US release of the system and served to show off the DS's 3D capabilities, but it wasn't just a port, it had a lot more content, including 3 new characters to play as, 30 more stars, and even new levels. They somewhat updated the visual aspects, like the character models, but generally speaking, they seem to try to keep the music mostly faithful to the original. This is in contrast to many other games that get remakes, where the music is typically rehauled on a much more grand level. But this is where we see more of Nintendo's efforts to touch up that classic soundtrack, tweaking it just enough to make it feel like that's how it's always sounded. Many of the major changes we see in the official soundtrack are present here, from the longer release of the main lead in Bob on Battlefield, to the extended melody in Hazy Maze Cave, and even the longer release of the keys in Dire Dire Docks. But besides implementing some improvements from the official soundtrack, there's a few unique differences here worth mentioning too. With the track Inside the Castle Walls, there's differences in expression between the Nintendo 64, soundtrack, and DS versions. In the soundtrack, there's a lot more emphasis on increasing dynamic range, while in the DS version, it sounds like there's a lot more thought put into the expression of the notes. In regards to tempo, the DS seems to be a little more faithful to the speed of the Nintendo 64 version, while the official soundtrack is often found playing songs much faster, with this song being no exception. Panning is generally more balanced in the DS version's music as a whole, with a lot of songs having instruments not panned as hard as the other versions. The instrument sample recordings themselves seem to be quite different, not that they're recordings of different source instruments, but the way the sample files are implemented. I'm presuming what's happening here is Nintendo has clean recordings of the instruments they sampled from their various sources, and then they insert those into their games with their own development kits, which by design will perform various conversions and compression on them. The samples in the DS version are typically shorter, and are usually pitched differently from the samples that exist in the Nintendo 64 version. There's some instances where samples actually gain an increase of fidelity by including more content in the high end that was previously missing in the Nintendo 64 version. But this isn't to say the DS version necessarily has higher quality samples, as many of them suffer from obvious artifacts, likely introduced during the implementation of the samples. Overall, I'd consider the changes made in the DS version an improvement over the Nintendo 64 version as well, quality differences aside. But now it's time to look at Nintendo's next move with this game. At the time of this video, it's their most recent, and also possibly one of their most controversial releases of Super Mario 64, Super Mario 3D All-Stars. This release is sort of a mix between a port, emulation, and a remaster of 3 of Mario's best 3D games. I think it did some things right. I enjoyed Galaxy on here more than the Wii version. I think the graphics in Sunshine look great, not to mention they gave us clean, previously unreleased versions of the cutscene music without dialogue. Regardless of the possible qualms you might have with those two games, I think almost everyone was severely underwhelmed and disappointed with Super Mario 64 in this release. It's less of what they did and more of what they didn't do. In Sunshine, they made it widescreen, but not in Super Mario 64. Again, in Sunshine, they gave it some of the most crisp and clean textures you've ever seen. And in Super Mario 64, only some of it was redone, and the rest were upscaled to a bare minimum degree of quality. They also left the game at its original frame rate, along with some other issues I'll cover shortly. Now, you might think that those are minor nitpicks, but you also have to remember that the Super Mario 64 decompilation project, along with all the ports based on it, were released before 3D All-Stars. So you already had Super Mario 64 with all of those features available on the Switch, along with countless other improvements, all made by the community. So honestly, the bar was kind of high. But hey, at least the music should be the same old classic Super Mario 64, right? Let's go take a listen. Do I have cotton in my ears or something? Nope, and neither do you. Hopefully. They really did just cut all of the high end off the entire audio output. To refresh your memory, here's what the original Nintendo 64 version sounds like. And again from 3D All-Stars. Yeah, it's really that bad. I'm honestly not sure what exactly is going on here. I can only assume they're applying some sort of low-pass filter after the emulation. But even then, there's inconsistencies across various songs in the game. What a way to make an already disappointing release even worse. The music is otherwise seemingly identical to the Shindo version. Which leads me to something I've been intentionally waiting to talk about until now. All of those comparisons against the Nintendo 64 version were using the US release, but every single region and version has some differences. Every copy of Mario 64 is personalized? I mentioned how the OST version had less staccato sounding strings in the opening theme, but if you grew up with the EU version, that's how you've always heard it. Likewise, in Bob on Battlefield, the release on the main lead is at least a little closer to the OST version on both the EU and Shindo versions. let's take a closer look at Dire Dire Docks again. In the EU version, the reverb settings have been drastically changed and lead to some strange metal tones that honestly I don't think sound too great. Like every single version of the Super Mario 64 soundtrack, each region has countless little changes here and there. Almost no two versions of a song are exactly alike across the different regions, although generally, the first Japanese release and the US release seem to be the most similar. So that was a fun deep dive on the differences between the music of the different versions and releases of Super Mario 64. Now that brings us back to the question of this video. Is there some grand conspiracy by Nintendo to slowly change the songs we all know and love over time in an attempt to gaslight a few particular people who might remember a specific detail being slightly different? Yeah.